Let me start with something simple. Something no one argues about. In 1885, a building rose above the streets of Chicago. 10 stories tall, steel, glass, weight stacked on top of weight in a way the world had never seen before. We call it the first skyscraper. We give credit to William LeBaron Jenney. We package the story neatly. It gets printed in textbooks. It gets taught in classrooms. Then everyone moves on, but there is one question that quietly lingers in the background. How did they actually build it? Not the theory, not the drawings, not the celebration headlines, the real process, raw effort, logistics. Best when you stop and think about it, something feels off. This was a time of horse-drawn transport, tools that would look primitive today. No reliable electricity in many places, no modern machines, no precision equipment like we have now. So how did they cut massive stone blocks, move them across long distances, shape them with extreme precision, lift them into the air, align everything perfectly, and lock it all together so tightly that even modern engineers would respect it? That question is not poetic. It is literal. How? Now here is where things become even more unsettling. You look through old photographs from that era, you will find something strange. Not what is shown, but what is missing. There are thousands of images of finished buildings. Beautiful ones, detailed ones, facades covered in intricate designs, interiors filled with handcrafted metalwork and stone carving that feels almost impossible. There are portraits of architects, wealthy sponsors, politicians smiling at opening ceremonies, but when you look for the actual construction process, the images fade away. Not completely gone, but incomplete in a very specific way, and that is where the discomfort begins, because real progress usually leaves a messy trail behind. Think about flight. Early experiments, failures, crash, years of trial and error before success. Think about steam engines. Crude beginnings, slow improvements, decades of refinement. There is always a middle phase, a long period where things go wrong before they go right. But with these buildings, that middle phase feels strangely quiet. Where are the failed skyscrapers? Where are the half-collapsed attempts? Where are the structures that almost worked but did not? Instead, what we see are buildings that appear almost fully realized, confident, precise, as if the learning process happened somewhere else. Imagine standing in front of the Flatiron Building in 1902, 22 stories rising into the air, a narrow edge cutting through the intersection like a blade, steel hidden beneath layers of stone. Look up, and for a moment, something feels wrong, not visually, but instinctively. Your mind understands weight, gravity, effort, and something deep inside whispers that this should not exist the way it does. No. Shift to Melbourne in 1888. A city barely -1 years into its development suddenly produces a structure like the Rialto building. Detailed stonework, Gothic style, designs that feel like they belong in ancient Europe. How does a young settlement create something that looks like it came from centuries of tradition? Then look at Sao Paulo, or Cairo, or Buenos Aires, or Shanghai. Different continents, different conditions, different levels of development, yet within the same narrow window of time. Similar architectural complexity appears across the world. That is not just coincidence, it is a pattern, and patterns demand explanation. Think about the workforce behind these structures. Take the Biltmore estate. Construction began in 1889, a massive estate filled with detailed stonework, dozens of rooms, huge halls, every surface touched by skilled craftsmanship. Stone was not local. It had to be transported, shaped, fitted perfectly into place. All of this was done in just a few years with a workforce of around 1,000 men. Pause for a moment and really think about that. 1,000 workers creating miles of intricate stone detail. No power tools, no advanced machinery, no digital precision, just human hands. Now ask yourself something deeper. Where did that level of skill come from? Master stonework is not something you learn in a few months. It takes years, sometimes a lifetime. You need teachers, traditions, systems of training. You need entire generations passing knowledge forward. So where were those systems? Where are the records of those schools? Where are the long chains of apprentices learning and perfecting these techniques? Because skill does not appear out of nowhere. It has roots, and those roots should leave evidence. But when you search for that evidence, it feels fine, almost like pieces are missing. And this is where another strange detail enters the story. If you study old maps from the early 1800s, you will notice a name that appears again and again: Tartaria, massive regions stretching across large parts of Eurasia, clearly labeled, recognized by mapmakers of the time. Then slowly, over the years, the name begins to disappear. It does not vanish all at once. It fades. Land is divided, renamed, absorbed into new borders, and eventually, the name is gone, almost as if it was never there. Connect that with everything else: advanced Architecture appearing set in legible patterns that line up to neatly missing construction records unclear origins of skilled labor a lost name on old maps individually. Each of these details might mean nothing, but together they form something else amazing harder to ignore because the deeper you look, the less complete the story feels, and once you see that gap, it becomes impossible to unsee it. So here is the question no one seems to answer: if the history we were given is only part of the truth, and what exactly was left out? And more importantly, who decided it should be forgotten? Let me take you deeper into this story, because this is where things stop feeling normal. There is a detail most people ignore. A quiet detail hiding in plain sight. The ornament. Look closely at these buildings, not just their height or size. Look at the surfaces, the carvings, the patterns, the tiny details that most people walk past without thinking. If these structures were truly new inventions built by people learning as they went, you would expect something different. You would expect simplicity. You would expect rough designs, basic shapes, functional walls, maybe even mistakes, because that is how every technology begins. It starts messy, it improves slowly, it earns its beauty over time, but that is not what we see here from the very beginning. These buildings are covered in detail, faces carved into stone, creatures frozen in place, patterns repeating with perfect precision, columns polished to a level that feels almost impossible, designs that look like they came from a world that had already mastered this craft long before these cities existed. And here is the unsettling part: these details are not added later, they are built into the structure itself. That means the people who designed these buildings already knew exactly what they were doing before the first stone was even placed. They knew how complex it could be, they knew how far they could push it. It is not the behavior of a civilization experimenting, that is the behavior of a civilization continuing something it already understands. No, let me show you something even stranger. In Chicago, there was a building completed in 1888 called the Rookery Building. Inside it, there is ironwork so intricate that even today, some experts are not completely sure how certain parts were assembled at scale. Think about that for a moment. Modern knowledge looking back at the past and still asking questions. No, move to Washington, D.C. The Library of Congress was completed in 1897. Inside that building are more than 100,000 pieces of art, sculptures, paintings, mosaics, details, layered on top of details, and all of it created within just over a decade. According to official explanations, many of the methods used were being figured out during the process, but ask yourself honestly, how many times can something be figured out along the way before that explanation starts to feel incomplete? Because every technology has a phase where it struggles early. Cars looked strange and unreliable early. Aircraft were dangerous and unstable early. Machines failed again and again before they succeeded. There is always an awkward stagia period where things do not work properly. So where is that stage for these buildings? Where are the early attempts that went wrong? Where are the structures that show mistakes? Where are the designs that had to be simplified halfway through because they were too ambitious? They are almost nowhere to be found. Instead, what appears is something else entirely: a fully developed style, confident, consistent, repeated across different parts of the world as if it arrived already competent. Then something even more unsettling happens. It disappears by the early 1900s. The heavy ornament begins to fade, carvings stop, detailed stonework vanishes, buildings become simpler, cleaner, more plain. Official explanation says this was progress, a shift toward modern design, a new way of thinking. But there is another possibility: and if it was not a choice, what if something was lost? What if the knowledge required to create those intricate details started to fade away? The craftsmen who knew these skills would not live forever. And if the system that trained them disappeared, then the knowledge would disappear with them, not slowly but all at once. And here is something else that keeps repeating. When you search for records of how these buildings were constructed, you notice gaps. Strange gaps. Photographs often begin when the building is already halfway complete. The earliest stages are missing, worker records are limited. Names of skilled artisans appear briefly in documents and then vanish without a trace. No detailed records of their workshops, no clear evidence of training systems, no long history showing how these skills were passed down. It is as if the people behind the most important parts of the work were never fully documented. That silence feels deliberate. No, I want to be careful. Here I am not saying that Tartary was some hidden empire responsible for everything you see. That would be the easy version of the story, the comfortable version, but the truth is rarely that simple. What I am asking is something much more unsettling. Is it possible that whatever existed in that vast region has been erased more completely than we realize? Is it possible that knowledge moved quietly across continents through trade, through migration, through forgotten connections? Is it possible that what we see in places like Chicago or Melbourne or Sao Paulo was not the beginning of something new but the final echo of something much older? Because once you start seeing the pattern you cannot unsee, and the question changes. It is no longer about if something is missing, it becomes about how much is missing and, more importantly, who made sure it stayed that way. Let me slow this down for a moment because this is where the story becomes even more unsettling. I want to be very clear about what I am saying. I am not claiming that records were destroyed. I am asking something more uncomfortable. What if many of those records never truly existed in the way we expect them to? Because there is a difference between something being lost and something never being properly written down at all. Now think about how knowledge is usually passed. Today we rely on documents, plans, systems, organized records, but not every tradition works like that. What if some of the people who built these structures came from a completely different kind of system? A system where knowledge was not written, a system where skill lived inside the human body, inside the hands, inside the eyes, inside muscle memory built over years of repetition. In that kind of world you do not need manuals, you learn by watching, by doing, by repeating. Now imagine what happens when that kind of tradition reaches its end. The last masters grow old, the students never fully replace them, the chain breaks. What would that look like in history? It would look exactly like what we see now. Fragments, partial records, photographs that begin to late, names that appear once and then disappear, skills that clearly existed but have no clear origin. The official explanation is not completely wrong, but it feels thin. And the thinner it feels, the more it makes you wonder what is hiding beneath it. Now let's go back to something we have not fully faced yet: coordination. In the late 1800s there was no fast global communication, no instant sharing of ideas. Messages traveled slowly, information was limited. And yet across the world cities were building structures that looked strangely connected. Look at Chicago, look at Melbourne, look at Buenos Aires. Different continents, different cultures, different conditions. But the buildings share something deeper than style. They share proportion, they share structure, they share the way decoration and engineering fit together perfectly. That suggests something important, a shared source. So what was that source? The common answer points to schools like the École des Beaux-Arts. And yes, that explains part of it: design ideas, balance, symmetry. But it does not explain the hands that built it. Architects create the vision, but they do not carve the stone, they do not shape the iron. They do not spend years perfecting the smallest details. That requires craftsmen, and craftsmen are trained through long traditions, through workshops, through years of learning from masters. So where are those traditions? Where are the records of those workshops? Why do they appear so faint across multiple cities at the same time? That pattern repeats again and again. Thin records everywhere. Not in one place, not in two, but almost everywhere these buildings appear. Now let me ask a different question. Not about building, but about forgetting. When societies forget something, they rarely forget everything. Pieces survive, in traditions passed quietly from one generation to another, in places far from the centers of power, and when you look closely you do find traces. In parts of Central Asia, along old trade routes. In remote regions of Eastern Europe, there are building techniques that feel strangely familiar. Not identical, but close enough to raise questions. Their connection to the grand buildings of the 1800s is not proven, but it is not fully explained either, and that matters, because once you start seeing these small connections they begin to gather, and when they gather they stop feeling. The official explanation asks you to believe something very specific, that similar techniques appeared independently in many places at the same time. That level of coincidence starts to feel unlikely, almost forced, like a story that was accepted because it was convenient. But the evidence points somewhere else, not to a clear answer, but to a pattern. A pattern where ability appears faster than expected, where knowledge exists without clear origins, where coordination happens without obvious communication, where a tradition rises and then disappears within a single century. And at the center of that pattern there is a name. Tartary, not necessarily an empire, not something simple, but a placeholder for something we do not fully understand yet. Maybe it was a network. Maybe it was a collection of traditions. Maybe it was something entirely different. I do not have a clean answer, and I think that honesty matters, because sometimes the truth is not a conclusion. Sometimes it is a question that refuses to go away, so I want you to do something simple. The next time you walk past an old building, stop for a moment. Look at it closely, look at the detail, look at the precision. Then ask yourself something honestly. Does the story you have been told truly explain what you are seeing? Or does it only describe it without revealing how it was done? Because there is a difference between describing something and understanding it. These buildings still stand, silent, unchanged. They hold their secrets without effort. They show us what was possible, but they do not tell us how. They were built with knowledge we cannot fully trace, and then somehow that knowledge disappeared. Not improved, not replaced, just gone, and almost no one seems disturbed by that. Maybe that is the strangest part of all. Maybe the real mystery is not what was built. Maybe the real mystery is why no one is asking harder questions about it.